Welcome back to my channel. I'm going to continue to read Caliban and the Witch by Sylvia Federici. We're now on chapter 4, which is called The Great Witch Hunt in Europe. It's too dark in here. Here's a woodcut by Jan Luyken about the execution of Anne Hendricks for witchcraft in Amsterdam in 1571. And some quotes. Une bête imparfaite, sans foi, sans crainte, sans constance. An imperfect beast without something, without something, without something. A French 17th century saying about women. Down from the waist they are centaurs, though women all above, but to the girdle do the gods inherit. Beneath is all the fiends. There is hell, there is darkness, there is the sulphurous pit. Burning, scalding, stench, consumption. Shakespeare's King Lear. You are the true hyenas that allure us with the fairness of your skins. And when folly has brought us within your reach, you leap upon us. You are the traitors of wisdom, the impediment to industry, the clogs to virtue, and the goads that drive us to all vices, impiety, and ruin. You are the fool's paradise, the wise man's plague, and the grand error of nature. Walter Charlton, Ephesian Matron, 1659. Introduction. The witch hunt rarely appears in the history of the proletariat. To this day it remains one of the most understudied phenomena in European history, or rather, world history, if we consider that the charge of devil worshipping was carried by missionaries and conquistadors to the New World as a tool for the subjugation of the local populations. That the victims in Europe were mostly peasant women may account for the historians' past indifference toward this genocide, an indifference that has bordered on complicity, since the elimination of the witches from the pages of history has contributed to trivializing their physical elimination at the stake, suggesting that it was a phenomenon of minor significance, if not a matter of folklore. Even those who have studied the witch hunt in the past, almost exclusively men, were often worthy heirs of the 16th century demonologists. While deploring the extermination of the witches, many have insisted on portraying them as wretched fools afflicted by hallucinations, so that their persecution could be explained as a process of social therapy serving to reinforce neighborly cohesion, or could be described in medical terms as a panic, a craze, an epidemic, all characterizations that exculpate the witch hunters and depoliticize their crimes. Examples of the misogyny that has inspired the scholarly approach to the witch hunt abound. As Mary Daly pointed out as late as 1978, much of the literature on this topic has been written from a women executing viewpoint that discredits the victims of the persecution by portraying them as social failures, women dishonored, or frustrated in love, or even as perverts who enjoyed teasing their male inquisitors with their sexual fantasies. Daly cites the example of F.G. Alexander's and S.T. Selznick's The History of Psychiatry, where we read that accused witches oftentimes played into the hands of the persecutors, a witch relieved her guilt by confessing her sexual fantasies in open court. At the same time, she achieved some erotic gratification by dwelling on all the details before her male accusers. These severely emotionally disturbed women were particularly susceptible to the suggestion that they harbored demons and devils and would confess to cohabiting with evil spirits, much as disturbed individuals today, influenced by newspaper headlines, fantasy themselves as sought-after murderers. Daily, 1978. There have been exceptions to this tendency to blame the victims, both among the first and second generation of witch hunt scholars. Among the latter, we should remember Alan McFarlane, 1970, E.W. Monter, I'm not going to read the years, and Alfred So Mann. But it was only in the wake of the feminist movement that the witch hunt emerged from the underground to which it had been confined, thanks to the feminists' identification with the witches, who were soon adopted as a symbol of female revolt. Feminists were quick to recognize that hundreds of thousands of women could not have been massacred and subjected to the cruelest tortures unless they posed a challenge to the power structure. They also realized that such a war against women, carried out over a period of at least 2 centuries, was a turning point in the history of women in Europe, the original sin in the process of social degradation that women suffered with the advent of capitalism, and a phenomenon, therefore, to which we must continually return if we are to understand the misogyny that still characterizes institutional practice and male-female relations. Marxist historians, by contrast, even when studying the transition to capitalism, with very few exceptions, have consigned the witch hunt to oblivion, as if it were irrelevant to the history of the class struggle. Yet the dimensions of the massacre should have raised some suspicion, as hundreds of thousands of women were burned, hanged, and tortured in less than 2 centuries. It should also have seemed significant that the witch hunt occurred simultaneously with the colonization and extermination of the populations of the New World, the English enclosures, the beginning of the slave trade, the enactment of bloody laws against vagabonds and beggars, and it climaxed in the interregnum between the end of feudalism and the capitalist takeoff, when the peasantry in Europe reached the peak of its power, but in time also consummated in its historic defeat. So far, however, this aspect of primitive accumulation has truly remained a secret. Witch burning times and the state initiative. What has not been recognized is that the witch hunt was one of the most important events in the development of capitalist society and the formation of the modern proletariat. For the unleashing of a campaign of terror against women, unmatched by any other persecution, weakened the resistance of the European peasantry to the assault launched against it by the gentry and the state. At a time when the peasant community was already disintegrating under the combined impact of land privatization, increased taxation, and the extension of state control over every aspect of social life, the witch hunt deepened the divisions between women and men, teaching men to fear the power of women, and destroyed a universe of practices, beliefs, and social subjects whose existence was incompatible with the capitalist work discipline, thus redefining the main elements of social reproduction. In this sense, like the contemporary attack on popular culture and the great confinement of paupers and vagabonds in workhouses and correction houses, the witch hunt was an essential aspect of primitive accumulation and the transition to capitalism. Later we will see what fears the witch hunt dispelled for the European ruling class and what were its effects for the position of women in Europe. Here I want to stress that contrary to the view propagated by the Enlightenment, the witch hunt was not the last spark of a dying feudal world. It is well established that the superstitious Middle Ages did not persecute any witches. The very concept of witchcraft did not take shape until the late Middle Ages. and never, in the Dark Ages, were there mass trials and executions, despite the fact that magic permeated daily life, and since the late Roman Empire it had been feared by the ruling class as a tool of insubordination among the slaves. In the 7th and 8th centuries, the crime of maleficium was introduced in the codes of the new Teutonic kingdoms, as it had been in the Roman code. This was the time of the Arab conquest that apparently inflamed the hearts of the slaves in Europe with the prospect of freedom, inspiring them to take arms against their owners. Thus, this legal innovation may have been a reaction to the fear generated among the elites by the advance of the Saracens, who were reputedly great experts in the magical arts. But at this time, under the name of maleficium, only magical practices were punished that inflicted damage to persons and things, and the church criticized those who believed in magical deeds. The situation changed by the mid-15th century. It was in this age of popular revolts, epidemics, and incipient feudal crisis that we have the first witch trials in southern France, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, the first descriptions of the Sabbat, and the development of the doctrine of witchcraft, by which sorcery was declared a form of heresy and the highest crime against God, nature, and the state. Between 1435 and 1487, 28 treatises on witchcraft were written, culminating on the eve of Columbus's voyage with the publication of the 1486 of the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, that following a new papal bull on the subject, Innocent VIII's Summus Desiderantes indicated that the Church considered witchcraft a new threat. However, the intellectual climate that prevailed during the Renaissance, especially in Italy, was still characterized by skepticism toward anything relating to the supernatural. Italian intellectuals from Ludovico Ariosto to Giordano Bruno and Niccolò Machiavelli looked with irony at the clerical tales concerning the deeds of the devil, stressing by contrast, especially in the case of Bruno, the nefarious power of gold and money. Non incanti ma contanti, not charms but coins, is the motto of a character in one of Bruno's comedies, summing up the perspective of the intellectual elite and the aristocratic circles of the time. Here's a woodcut of the Witches' Sabbath. This was the first and most famous of a series of engravings the German artist Hans Boulding-Green produced, starting in 1510, pornographically exploiting the female body under the guise of denunciation. It was after the mid-16th century, in the very decades in which the Spanish conquistadors were subjugating the American populations, that the number of women tried as witches escalated, and the initiative for the persecution passed from the Inquisition to the secular courts. Witch hunting reached its peak between 1580 and 1630, in a period that is, when feudal relations were already giving way to the economic and political institutions typical of mercantile capitalism. It was in this long iron century that, almost by a tacit agreement, in countries often at war against each other, the stakes multiplied and the state started denouncing the existence of witches and taking the initiative of the persecution. It was the Carolina, the imperial legal code enacted by the Catholic Charles V in 1532, that established that witchcraft be punished by death. In Protestant England, the persecution was legalized by 3 acts of Parliament passed in 1542, 1563, and 1604, this last introducing the death penalty, even in the absence of any damage inflicted upon persons and things. After 1550, laws and ordinances making witchcraft a capital crime and inciting the population to denounce suspected witches were also passed in Scotland, Switzerland, France, and the Spanish Netherlands. These were reissued in subsequent years to expand the number of those who could be executed, and again make witchcraft as such, rather than the damages presumably provoked by it, the major crime. The mechanisms of the persecution confirm that the witch hunt was not a spontaneous process, a movement from below to which the ruling and administrative classes were obliged to respond. As Christina Larner has shown in the case of Scotland, a witch hunt required much official organization and administration. Before neighbor accused neighbor, or entire communities were seized by a panic, a steady indoctrination took place, with the authorities publicly expressing anxiety about the spreading of witches and traveling from village to village in order to teach people how to recognize them, in some cases carrying with them lists with the names of suspected witches and threatening to punish those who hid them or came to their assistance. In Scotland, with the Synod of Aberdeen, the ministers of the Presbyterian Church were ordered to ask their parishioners under oath if they suspected anyone of being a witch. Boxes were placed in the churches to allow the informers to remain anonymous. And then, after a woman had fallen under suspicion, the minister exhorted the faithful from the pulpit to testify against her and forbid anyone to give her help. In other countries, too, denunciations were solicited. In Germany, this was the task of the visitors appointed by the Lutheran Church, with the consent of the German princes. In northern Italy, it was the ministers and the authorities who fueled suspicions and made sure that they would result in denunciations. They also made sure that the accused would be totally isolated, forcing them, among other things, to carry signs on their dresses so that people would keep away from them. The witch hunt was also the first persecution in Europe that made use of a multimedia propaganda to generate a mass psychosis among the population, alerting the public of the dangers posed by the witches through pamphlets publicizing the most famous trials and the details of their atrocious deeds was one of the first tasks of the printing press. Artists were recruited to the task, among them the German Hans Baldung, to whom we owe the most damning portrait of witches. But it was the jurists, the magistrates, and the demonologists, often embodied by the same person, who most contributed to the persecution. They were the ones who systematized the arguments, answered the critics, and perfected a legal machine that by the end of the 16th century gave a standardized, almost bureaucratic format to the trials, accounting for the similarities of the confessions across national boundaries. In their work, the men of the law could count on the cooperation of the most reputed intellectuals of the time, including philosophers and scientists who are still praised as the fathers of modern rationalism. Among them was the English political theorist Thomas Hobbes, who, despite his skepticism concerning the reality of witchcraft, approved the persecution as a means of social control. A fierce enemy of witches, obsessive in his hatred for them and in his calls for bloodshed, was Jean Baudin, the famous French lawyer and political theorist, whom historian Trevor Roper calls the Aristotle and Montesquieu of the 16th century. Baudin, who is credited with authoring the first treatise on inflation, participated in many trials, wrote a volume of proofs called Demomania in 1580, in which he insisted that witches should be burned alive instead of being mercifully strangled before being thrown to the flames, that they should be cauterized so that their flesh should rot before death, and that children too be burned. Baudin was not an isolated case. In this century of geniuses, Bacon, Kepler, Galileo, Shakespeare, Pascal, Descartes, a century that saw the triumph of the Copernican revolution, the birth of modern science, and the development of philosophical and scientific rationalism, witchcraft became one of the favorite subjects of debate for the European intellectual elites. Judges, lawyers, statesmen, philosophers, scientists, theologians all became preoccupied with the problem, wrote pamphlets and demonologies, agreed that this was the most nefarious crime, and called for its punishment. There can be no doubt, then, that the witch hunt was a major political initiative. To stress this point is not to minimize the role that the Church played in the persecution. The Roman Catholic Church provided the metaphysical and ideological scaffold of the witch hunt, and instigated the persecution of witches as it had previously instigated the persecution of the heretics. Without the Inquisition, the many papal bulls urging the secular authorities to seek out and punish witches, and above all, without centuries of the Church's misogynist campaigns against women, the witch hunt would not have been possible. But contrary to the stereotype, the witch hunt is not just a product of popish fanaticism or of the machinations of the Roman Inquisition. At its peak, the secular courts conducted most of the trials, while in the areas where the Inquisition operated, Italy and Spain, the number of executions remained comparatively low. After the Protestant Reformation, which undermined the Catholic Church's power, the Inquisition even began to restrain the zeal of the authorities against witches, while intensifying its persecution of Jews. Moreover, the Inquisition always depended on the cooperation of the state to carry out the executions, as the clergy wanted to be spared the embarrassment of shedding blood. The collaboration between church and state was even closer in the areas of the Reformation, where the state had become the church, as in England, or the church had become the state, as in Geneva, and to a lesser extent Scotland. Here one branch of power legislated and executed, and religious ideology openly revealed its political connotations. The political nature of the witch hunt is further demonstrated by the fact that both Catholic and Protestant nations, at war against each other in every other respect, joined arms and shared arguments to persecute witches. Thus it is no exaggeration to claim that the witch hunt was the first unifying terrain in the politics of the new European nation-states, the first example after the schism brought about by the Reformation of a European unification. For, crossing all boundaries, the witch hunt spread from France and Italy to Germany, Switzerland, England, Scotland, and Sweden. What fears instigated such concerted policy of genocide? Why was so much violence unleashed, and why were its primary targets women? Devil beliefs and changes in the mode of production. It must be immediately stated that to this day there are no sure answers to these questions. A major obstacle in the way of an explanation has been the fact that the charges against the witches are so grotesque and unbelievable as to be incommensurable with any motivation or crime. How to account for the fact that for more than 2 centuries in several European countries, hundreds of thousands of women were tried, tortured, burned alive, or hanged, accused of having sold body and soul to the devil, and by magical means murdered scores of children, sucked their blood, made potions with their flesh, caused the death of their neighbors, destroyed cattle and crops, raised storms, and performed many other abominations. However, even today some historians ask us to believe that the witch hunt was quite reasonable in the context of the contemporary belief structure. An added problem is that we do not have the viewpoint of the victims, for all that remains of their voices are the confessions styled by the inquisitors, usually obtained under torture, and no matter how well we listen, as Carlo Ginzburg has done, to what transpires of traditional folklore from between the cracks in the recorded confessions, we have no way of establishing their authenticity. Further, one cannot account for the extermination of the witches as simply a product of greed, as no reward comparable to the riches of the Americas could be obtained from the execution and the confiscation of the goods of women who were in the majority very poor. It is for these reasons that some historians, like Brian Levac, abstain from presenting any explanatory theory, contenting themselves with identifying the preconditions for the witch hunt. For instance, the shift in legal procedure from a private to a public accusatory system that occurred in the late Middle Ages, the centralization of state power, the impact of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation on social life. In northern Italy, no. I was right. There is no need, however, for such agnosticism, nor do we have to decide whether the witch hunters truly believed in the charges which they leveled against their victims, or cynically used them as instruments of social repression. If we consider the historical context in which the witch hunt occurred, the gender and class of the accused, and the effects of the persecution, then we must conclude that witch hunting in Europe was an attack on women's resistance to the spread of capitalist relations and the power that women had gained by virtue of their sexuality, their control over reproduction, and their ability to heal. Witch hunting was also instrumental to the construction of a new patriarchal order, where women's bodies, their labor, their sexual and reproductive powers were placed under the control of the state and transformed into economic resources. This means that the witch hunters were less interested in the punishment of any specific transgressions than in the elimination of generalized forms of female behavior which they no longer tolerated and had to be made abominable in the eyes of the population. That the charges in the trials often referred to events that had occurred decades earlier, that witchcraft was made a crimen exceptum, that is, a crime to be investigated by special means, torture included, and it was punishable even in the absence of any proven damage to persons and things. All these factors indicate that the target of the witch hunt, as it is often true with political repression in times of intense social change and conflict, were not socially recognized crimes, but previously accepted practices and groups of individuals that had to be eradicated from the community through terror and criminalization. In this sense, the charge of witchcraft performed a function similar to that performed by high treason, which, significantly, was introduced into the English legal code in the same years, and the charge of terrorism in our times. The very vagueness of the charge, the fact that it was impossible to prove it, while at the same time it evoked the maximum of horror, meant that it could be used to punish any form of protest and to generate suspicion even towards the most ordinary aspects of daily life. A first insight into the meaning of the European witch hunt can be found in the thesis proposed by Michael Taussig in his classic work, The Devil and Commodity Fetishism in South America. I want to read that. Where the author maintains that devil beliefs arise in those historical periods when one mode of production is being supplanted by another. In such periods, not only are the material conditions of life radically transformed, but so are the metaphysical underpinnings of the social order. For instance, the conception of how value is created, what generates life and growth, what is natural and what is antagonistic to the established customs and social relations. Taussig developed his theory by studying the beliefs of Colombian agricultural laborers and Bolivian tin miners at a time when in both countries monetary relations were taking root that in people's eyes seemed deadly and even diabolical compared with the older and still surviving forms of subsistence-oriented production. Thus, in the cases Taussig studied, it was the poor who suspected the better off of devil worship. Still, his association between the devil and the commodity form reminds us that also in the background of the witch hunt there was the expansion of rural capitalism, which involved the abolition of customary rights and the first inflationary wave in modern Europe. These phenomena not only led to the growth of poverty, hunger, and social dislocation, they also transferred power into the hands of a new class of modernizers who looked with fear and repulsion at the communal forms of life that had been typical of pre-capitalist Europe. It was by the initiative of this proto-capitalist class that the witch hunt took off, both as a platform on which a wide range of popular beliefs and practices could be pursued, and a weapon by which resistance to social and economic restructuring could be defeated. It is significant that, in England, most of the witch trials occurred in Essex, where by the 16th century the bulk of the land had been enclosed, while in those regions of the British Isles where land privatization had neither occurred nor was on the agenda, we have no record of witch hunting. The most outstanding examples in this context are Ireland and the Scottish Western Highlands, where no trace can be found of the persecution, likely because a collective land tenure system and kinship ties still prevailed in both areas that precluded the communal divisions and the type of complicity with the state that made a witch hunt possible. Thus, while in the anglicized and privatized Scottish lowlands, where the subsistence economy was vanishing under the impact of the Presbyterian Reformation, the witch hunt claimed at least 4,000 victims, the equivalent of 1% of the female population. In the Highlands and in Ireland, women were safe during the witch-burning times. That the spread of rural capitalism, with all its consequences, land expropriation, the deepening of social distances, the breakdown of collective relations, was a decisive factor in the background of the witch hunt, is also proven by the fact that the majority of those accused were poor peasant women, cotters, wage laborers, while those who accused them were wealthy and prestigious members of the community, often their employers or landlords, that is, individuals who were part of the local power structures and often had close ties with the central state. Only as the persecution progressed, and the fear of witches, as well as the fear of being accused of witchcraft or of subversive association, was sowed among the population, did accusations also come from neighbors. In England, the witches were usually old women on public assistance, or women who survived by going from house to house begging for bits of food or a pot of wine or milk. If they were married, their husbands were day laborers, but more often they were widows and lived alone. Their poverty stands out in the confessions. It was in times of need that the devil appeared to them to assure them that from now on they should never want, although the money he would give them on such occasions would soon turn to ashes, a detail perhaps related to the experience of superinflation common at the time. As for the diabolical crimes of the witches, they appear to us as nothing more than the class struggle played out at the village level. The evil eye, the curse of the beggar, to whom an alm has been refused, the default on the payment of rent, the demand for public assistance, the many ways in which the class struggle contributed to the making of an English witch are shown by the charges against Margaret Harket, an old widow of 65, hanged at Tyburn in 1585. Hold up. Oh my god. No. She had picked a basket of peas in the neighbor's field without permission. I love peas. Asked to return them, she flung them down in anger, since then no pears would grow in the field. As she should. Why can't she have some peas? Come on. Margaret can't have some peas? A basket of peas. Later, William Goodwin's servant denied her yeast. Why can't she have yeast? Whereupon his brewing stand dried up. All this stuff seems fair and just. Why would you even take issue with it? She was struck by a bailiff who had caught her taking wood from the master's ground. She can't have wood from the ground? The bailiff went mad. A neighbor refused her a horse. All his horses died. A horse is kind of a big request. Another paid her less for a pair of shoes than she had asked. Later he died. A gentleman told his servant to refuse her buttermilk, after which they were unable to make butter or cheese. One finds the same pattern. Hold up. A classic image of the English witch, old, decrepit, surrounded by her animals and her cronies, gang, and yet maintaining a defiant posture. Honestly, goals. One finds the same pattern in the case of the women who were presented to court at Chelmsford, Windsor, and Osseth. Mother Waterhouse, hanged at Chelmsford in 1566. Was a very poor woman, described as begging for some cake or butter and falling out with many of her neighbors. Elizabeth Style, Mother Devil, Mother Margaret, and Mother Dutton, executed at Windsor in 1579, were also poor widows. Mother Margaret lived in the almshouse, like their alleged leader, Mother Satyr, and all of them run around begging and presumably taking revenge when denied. On being refused some old yeast, Elizabeth Francis, one of the Chelmsford witches, cursed a neighbor who later developed a great pain in her head. Mother Staunton suspiciously murmured, going away, when denied yeast by a neighbor, upon which the neighbor's child fell violently sick. Ursula Kemp, hanged at Osseth in 1582, made one Grace lame after being denied some cheese. She also caused a swelling in the bottom of Agnes's Letherdale's child, after the latter denied her some scouring sand. I mean, why did she just give her some sand? Why did they just give her the yeast? Alice Newman plagued Johnson, the collector for the poor, to death after he refused her 12 pence. He also punished one butler who denied her a piece of meat. I mean, all I see is stingy people. We find a similar pattern in Scotland, where the accused were also poor cottars, still holding on to a piece of land of their own, but barely surviving, and often arousing the hostility of their neighbors on account of having pushed their cattle to graze on their land or not having paid their rent. Witch hunting and class revolt. Hold up. Wait. Maybe I'll read one more section. How much have I read? Not that much. Like 10 pages. Witch hunting and class revolt. As we can see from these cases, the witch hunt grew in a social environment where the better sorts were living in constant fear of the lower classes, who would certainly be expected to harbor evil thoughts, because in this period they were losing everything they had. Hello. Like, they felt guilty. Alright. That this fear expressed itself as an attack on popular magic is not surprising. The battle against magic has always accompanied the development of capitalism to this very day. Magic is premised on the belief that the world is animated, unpredictable, and that there is a force in all things. Water, trees, substances, words. So that every event is interpreted as the expression of an occult power that must be deciphered and bent to one's will. I finally coughed. What this implied in everyday life is described, probably with some exaggeration, in the letter of a German minister sent after a pastoral visit to a village in 1594. The use of incantations is so widespread that there is no man or woman here who begins or does anything without first taking recourse to some sign, incantation, magic, or pagan means. For example, during labor pains, when picking up or putting down the child, when taking the beasts to the field, when they have lost an object or failed to find it, closing the windows at night, when someone gets ill or a cow behaves in a strange way, they run at once to the soothsayer to ask who robbed them, who's enchanted them, or to get an amulet. The daily experience of these people shows there is no limit to the use of superstitions. Everyone here takes part in superstitious practices with words, names, rhymes, using the names of God, of the Holy Trinity, of the Virgin Mary, of the 12 Apostles. These words are uttered both openly and in secret. They are written on pieces of paper, swallowed, carried as amulets. They also make strange signs, noises, and gestures. And then they practice magic with herbs, roots, and the branches of a certain tree. They have their particular day and place for all these things. As Stephen Wilson points out in The Magical Universe, the people who practiced these rituals were mostly poor people who struggled to survive, always trying to stave off disaster and wishing therefore to placate, cajole, and even manipulate these controlling forces, to keep away harm and evil, and to procure the good which consisted of fertility, well-being, health, and life. But in the eyes of the new capitalist class, this anarchic, molecular conception of the diffusion of power in the world was anathema. Aiming at controlling nature, the capitalist organization of work must refuse the unpredictability implicit in the practice of magic, and the possibility of establishing a privileged relation with the natural elements, as well as the belief in the existence of powers available only to particular individuals, and thus not easily generalized and exploitable. Magic was also an obstacle to the rationalization of the work process, and a threat to the establishment of the principle of individual responsibility. Above all, magic seemed a form of refusal of work, of insubordination, and an instrument of grassroots resistance to power. The world had to be disenchanted in order to be dominated. By the 16th century, the attack against magic was well underway, and women were its most likely targets. Even when they were not expert sorcerers or magicians, they were the ones who were called to mark animals when they fell sick, heal their neighbors, help them find lost or stolen objects, give them amulets or love potions, help them forecast the future. Though the witch hunt targeted a broad variety of female practices, it was above all in this capacity, as sorcerers, healers, performers of incantations and divinations, that women were persecuted. For their claim to magical power undermined the power of the authorities and the state, giving confidence to their poor in their ability to manipulate the natural and social environment and possibly subvert the constituted order. It is doubtful, on the other hand, that the magical arts that women had practiced for generations would have been magnified into a demonic conspiracy had they not occurred against a background of an intense social crisis and struggle. The coincidence between social economic crisis and witch hunting has been noted by Henry Kamen, who has observed that it was precisely in the period when there was the main price hike, between the end of the 16th century and the first half of the 17th, that there were the greatest numbers of charges and persecutions. Even more significant is the coincidence between the intensification of the persecution and the explosion of urban and rural revolts. These were the peasant wars against land privatization, including the uprisings against the enclosures in England in 1549, 1607, 1628, and 1631, when hundreds of men, women, and children, armed with pitchforks and spades, set about destroying the fences erected around the commons, proclaiming that from now on we needn't work anymore. In France in 1593 to 95, there was the revolt of the Croquants against the tithes, excessive taxation, and the rising price of bread, a phenomenon that caused mass starvation in large areas of Europe. During these revolts, it was often wait, hold up, okay. Here's a this graph indicating the dynamics of the witch trials between 1505 and 1650 refers specifically to the area of Namur and Lorraine in France, but it is representative of the persecution in other European countries. Everywhere the key decades were those from the 1550s to the 1630s, when the price of food escalated. So there's just like a large escalation in 1570 up till 16 like 40. During these revolts, it was often women who initiated and led the action. Exemplary were the revolt that occurred at Montpellier in 1645, which was started by women who were seeking to protect their children from starvation, and the revolt at Cordoba in 1652, that likewise was initiated by women. It was women, moreover, who, after the revolts were crushed, with many men imprisoned or slaughtered, remained to carry on the resistance, although in a more subterranean manner. This is what may have happened in southwestern Germany, where a witch hunt followed by 2 decades the end of the Peasant War. Writing on the subject, Eric Middlefort has excluded the existence of a connection between these two phenomena. However, he has not asked if there were family or community relations such as the ones Leroy Ladurie found in the Cevennes. It's probably not Leroy. Between the thousands of peasants who, from 1476 to 1525, continuously rose up in arms against feudal power and were so brutally defeated, and the scores of women who, less than 2 decades later, in the same region and villages, were brought to the stake. Yet we can well imagine that the ferocious work of repression which the German princes conducted, and the hundreds and thousands of peasants crucified, decapitated, burned alive, sedimented unquenchable hatred, secret plans of revenge among all the older women, who had seen and remembered, and were likely to make their hostility known in numerous ways to the local elites. The persecution of witches grew on this terrain. It was class war, carried out by other means. In this context, we cannot fail to see a connection between the fear of uprising and the prosecutor's insistence on the witches' Sabbat or synagogue, the famous nocturnal reunion where thousands of people presumably congregated, traveling often from far distances. Whether or not by evoking the horrors of the Sabbat, the authorities targeted actual forms of organization cannot be established, but there is no doubt that through the judge's obsessions with these devilish gatherings, beside the echo of the persecution of the Jews, we hear the echo of the secret meetings the peasants held at night on lonesome hills and in the forests to plot their revolts. The Italian historian Luisa Muraro has written on this matter in La Signora del Gioco, The Lady of the Game, a study of witch trials that took place in the Italian Alps at the beginning of the 16th century. During the trials in Val di Fiemme, one of the accused spontaneously told the judges that one night while she was in the mountains with her mother-in-law, she saw a great fire in the distance. Run away, her grandmother had cried. This is the fire of the Lady of the Game. Game, Gioco, in many dialects of northern Italy, is the oldest name for the Sabbat. In the trials of Val di Fiemme, there is still mention of a female figure who directed the game. In the same region in 1525, there was a vast peasant uprising. They demanded the elimination of tithes and tributes, the freedom to hunt, less convents, hostels for the poor, the right of each village to elect its priest. They burned castles, convents, and the clergy's houses, but they were defeated, massacred, and those who survived for years were hunted by the revenge of the authorities. This shit is crazy, man. Listen. Maroro concludes, the fire of the Lady of the Game fades in the distance, while in the foreground there are the fires of the revolt and the pyres of the repression. But to us there seems to be a connection between the peasant revolt that was being prepared and the tales of mysterious nightly gatherings. We can only assume that the peasants at night secretly met around a fire to warm up and communicate with each other, and that those who knew guarded the secret of these forbidden meetings by appealing to the old legend. If the witches had secrets, this may have been one. Class revolt, together with sexual transgression, was a central element in the descriptions of the Sabbat. which was portrayed both as a monstrous sexual orgy and as a subversive political gathering, culminating with an account of the crimes which the participants had committed, and with the devil instructing the witches to rebel against their masters. It is also significant that the pact between the witch and the devil was called conjuratio. I don't know Italian. Like the pacts often made by slaves and workers in struggles. And that in the eyes of the prosecutors, the devil represented a promise of love, power, and riches, for whose sake a person was willing to sell her or his soul, that is, to infringe every natural and social law. The threat of cannibalism, a central theme in the morphology of the Sabbat, also recalls, according to Henry Cayman, the morphology of the revolts. As rebel workers at times showed their contempt for those who sold their blood by threatening to eat them. Cayman mentions what happened in the town of Romans, Dauphine, France, in the winter of 1580, when the peasants in revolt against the tithes proclaimed that before 3 days Christian flesh will be sold, and then during the carnival the rebels' leader, dressed in a bear skin, ate delicacies which passed for Christian flesh. Again in Naples in 1585, during a riot against the high cost of bread, the rebels mutilated the body of the magistrate responsible for the price rise and offered pieces of his flesh for sale. Cayman points out that eating human flesh symbolized a total inversion of social values, consistent with the image of the witch as the personification of moral perversion, which is suggested by many of the rituals attributed to the practice of witchcraft. The Mass celebrated backwards, the counterclockwise dances. Indeed, the witch was the living symbol of the world turned upside down, a recurrent image in the literature of the Middle Ages, tied to millenarian aspirations of subversion of the social order. The subversive, utopian dimension of the witch's Sabbat is also stressed from a different angle by Luciano Parinetto, who in Strega e Potera has insisted on the need to give a modern interpretation of this gathering, reading its transgressive features from the viewpoint of the developing capitalist discipline of work. Parinetto points out that the nocturnal dimension of the Sabbat was a violation of the contemporary capitalist regularization of work time, and a challenge to private property and sexual orthodoxy, as the night shadows blurred the distinctions between the sexes and between mine and thine. Parinetto also argues that the flight, the travel, an important element in the charges against the witches, should be interpreted as an attack on the mobility of immigrant and itinerant workers, a new phenomenon reflected in the fear of vagabonds that much preoccupied the authorities in this period. Parinetto concludes that viewed in its historical specificity, the nocturnal Sabbat appears as a demonization of the utopia embodied in the rebellion against the masters and the breakdown of sexual roles, and it also represents a use of space and time contrary to the new capitalist work discipline. In this sense, there is a continuity between the witch hunt and the earlier persecution of the heretics, which also punished specific forms of social subversion under the guise of imposing religious orthodoxy. Significantly, the witch hunt developed first in the areas where the persecution of the heretics has been most intense. That is significant. The Jura, northern Italy. In some regions of Switzerland, in an early phase, witches were called Herige, or heretic, or Wadwa, Waldenses. Further, the heretics too were burned at the stake as traitors to the true religion, and they were accused of crimes that entered the decalogue of witchcraft: sodomy, infanticide, animal worship. In part, these were ritual charges that the Church had always moved against rival religions. But as we have seen, a sexual revolution had been an essential ingredient of the heretic movement, from the Cathars to the Adamites. The Cathars, in particular, had challenged the Church's degraded view of women and advocated the rejection of marriage and even of procreation, which they considered a form of entrapment for the soul. They had also embraced a Manichaean religion that, according to some historians, was responsible for the increased preoccupation of the Church in the late Middle Ages with the presence of the devil in the world and the inquisitorial view of witchcraft as a counter-church. Thus, the continuity between heresy and witchcraft, at least in the first phase of the witch hunt, cannot be doubted. But the witch hunt occurred in a different historical context, one that had been dramatically transformed, first by the traumas and dislocations produced by the Black Death, a watershed in European history, and later, in the 15th and 16th centuries, by the profound change in class relations brought about by the capitalist reorganization of economic and social life. Inevitably, then, even the apparent elements of continuity, e.g., the nocturnal promiscuous banquet, had a different meaning than their anticipations in the Church's struggle against the heretics. Alright, I'm gonna end there. I'll see you guys again soon to learn about witch hunting, women hunting, and the accumulation of labor. Thank you for watching this video. Please like and subscribe for more. Bye.